Okay. Assalamu alaikum to everyone who's here, to those live, to those on Facebook, and to those who will, inshallah, catch the recording. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulih al-kareem. Thank you everyone for joining our third session or our third installment of our larger series this Ramadan, where we take a look at different intellectual traditions. For those who were able to join the previous 2 weeks, we had Dr. Ovamir Anjum discuss liberalism, and Sister Aisha Hasan discuss feminism. And inshallah, the upcoming session next Saturday will be on secularism by Sister Dania, inshallah. Today, however, we have Dr. Osman Umarji. For those who've attended Al-Arqam's Ramadan session last year, they know he was one of our guest speakers. For those who attended the Usul al-Fiqh class, will also know he was one of our instructors, alhamdulillah. So he's no stranger to Al-Arqam. Today, the topic will be on scientism. Scientism is quite a broad subject. However, those familiar are likely familiar in the context of the da'wah scene, discussions and debates with atheists, etc. Today's talk, however, will be slightly different. It will be related to both the history of scientism, the history of religion, as well as how the two have interacted. And then there'll be a pivot to particular areas of concern for Muslims today, as well as an aspect related to just knowledge and uncertainty and how Muslims think about that. For those who don't know, Dr. Osman Umarji is the Director of Research at Yaqeen Institute, as well as a professor at the School of Education at the University of California, Irvine. His Islamic training with an emphasis on usul al-fiqh is from al-Azhar, and his degree in educational psychology, or his Ph.D. rather, in educational psychology, and his bachelor's degree in electrical engineering were both done at the University of California, Irvine, inshallah. As far as questions are concerned, comments, if you'll notice, today's chat is actually open as per the speaker's request. There will be points in today's discussion where your feedback and your contribution is welcomed, inshallah. For those who still do want to ask questions privately, feel free to message Q&A. There is a participant named Q&A. Just feel free to message them, and inshallah, we'll reserve the last 30 minutes to get through as many questions as we can. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it to Dr. Uthman, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, I'll share my screen and we'll get started. Bismillah wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. It is always an honor and a privilege to be in your esteemed audience. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to benefit from these blessed days of Ramadan. May He give us the strength to worship Him to the best of our ability during the last 10 blessed nights, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify the Muslim Ummah of all the un-Islamic ideologies that have filtered into our minds, into our lands, whether they be liberalism, secularism, scientism, feminism, and all the other isms that are out there. My talk today will be, there'll be a lot of thoughts. So at any moment in time, please stop me and offer your insights, your questions, your refutations, whatever. It's really meant to be a conversation. This is a topic that to me it's been something I've been wanting to dig deep into. So when the discussion came up about this year's Ramadan sessions, I said, it's high time that, I put my own time into thinking about this. As someone who was an engineer, as someone who did my graduate work and is trained in many ways in a school that thinks about the world through a lens of scientism and certain epistemologies that are not 100% in line with Islam, for me was this thing that kept nagging at me, that how do we think about this as Muslims? How do we present this to other Muslims who are either at the same level of scientific inquiry or who are just generally interested and concerned about their well-being and the ideologies that their children are absorbing? And so even at Yaqeen, a lot of my work right now is really at the nexus of trying to understand psychology in the Muslim world, and ensuring that what we're doing in the world of psychology and even neuroscience or any other hard sciences is not simply slapping an Islamic band-aid onto the existing theories that are out there and somehow calling them Islamic all of a sudden. So today I hope to talk about a number of things. These are some of the questions that I hope to pose, and hopefully we get some answers to. Number one is, what do we mean? Some of you might be here saying, what in the world is scientism? So we want to be very clear about the definitions. We'll speak about science and scientism. We'll really want to focus quite a bit on the historical context by which science, scientism, and religion have interacted, and where are the moments of convergence, of divergence, of harmony, of hegemony and conflict. And of course, most of my talk today will be centered around the Western world. So there's a rich tradition in the Muslim world and in the Eastern world. Just because of the context that we're living in, I'm going to limit most of my analyses and reflections to what's happening in European and American audiences. I really want to answer this question: is scientism actually part of science? And does science lead to any type of a certainty in truth? And hopefully get somewhat into what are some of the core issues of concern for Muslims. And I won't answer these questions as much as I'll raise them, because these are outstanding questions that I don't think have been answered yet. And so yeah, I'll begin with that. So really quick, as you look, I'm going to share a few images with you. And as you see these images, I want you to think about just what goes to your mind in terms of, well, let's just start and we'll see what comes up. So here's an image. We see this depiction of a scholar, and he's reading the Quran. Looks like he's in some sort of deep thought, right? He has books behind him. He has like a book on the floor, and he's seated on the ground. And so, you might imagine this might have been a common scene, in the traditional Islamic eras, right? In pre-modernity, in how a scholar might be thinking about his day-to-day work, sitting in his room or his office in deep thought and contemplation over the verses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and many other classical texts. And now you see an image of a modern scientist. He's on his chalkboard doing the same thing the scholar is doing, just in his own workspace. So he's in his office or he's in a classroom, and he is coming up with all kinds of complex phenomena. He's explaining in jargon that most of us probably don't understand, whether it's organic chemistry, it looks like some sort of calculus and advanced mathematics. And I want you to just draw your attention to quickly in terms of, what do you think is more difficult? What do you think is more prestigious? What do you think is more respected? And I'm sure, even though most of us on this call likely are heavily interested in the Islamic sciences, there is a knee-jerk reaction to think that the person on the right is somehow engaged in a more complex endeavor. And again, we can do that exact same endeavor by looking here. We see this man working with some sort of robotics, right, in some complex engineering setting, deep in his thought. And then you see these sisters, again in the library, deep in their own research, looking at different Islamic texts. And so the question that if you ask any Muslim teenager, any non-Muslim teenager or young adult, or pretty much any person in the world today, is which of these people are engaged in more serious work, and which one is more valued, which one is more respected. And sadly, those who are religious and those who are not religious likely will say that the person who's engaged in the scientific work is somehow doing more challenging, important, groundbreaking, valued work. And this, to me, comes to the question of the cultural status of science. And we have to have a historical understanding of where we gotten to this point in history, where even today, for most parents, when we send how many of us have thought about, we want our children to be scholars of tafsir, we want them to be scholars of hadith, we want them to be truly experts of the Islamic tradition, and that's their path to success in this life and the next life. That's their career aspiration, that we're inculcating an environment for that. Likely, most of us are either professionals in our own sense, in a secular sense, we're engineers, we're doctors, we're lawyers, we're in some field that's been trained in a modern university, and we want our kids likely to be in those same spaces. And this speaks to the cultural status of science. And I want to walk through quickly the steady rise of science and its sustained prominence in the world, especially in the Western world, the steady decline of religion and its diminished prominence in the Western and even in the Eastern world, and then the idea that science has been packaged as an alternative to religion, and kind of understanding that, what does this mean for us? Some of the more interesting arguments that are out there or discussions really talk about how this is a unique phenomenon in world cultures where the West evaluates its progress in terms of scientific terms. And so really scientific developments is the hallmark of its society. And so the objectivity and certainty that science is supposed to provide is used to justify the West's superiority in the world. So even today, when Muslims look up to the West, they don't look up to the West in terms of its moral standing, right, or its ability to provide deeper philosophical answers, or even in the arts or the humanities. We look at the West as championing the certainty and the objectivity that science supposedly brings us. And that's why the Muslim world aspires to be Western in many different ways. And just to show you briefly, just a question that we have to answer is these trends that science, its prominence is increasing, the prominence of religion is decreasing. And you can see this as a chart. This shows us from 1972 to 2018 here in 2016, the rise in the US population from those who no longer affiliate with a religion. And you can see that from the 70s all the way until the early 90s, it was only between about it hit a peak of 8% in 78, but generally you're looking around 5, 6%, 7% of Americans all the way up until 1991 said that they did not affiliate with a religion. So I think that's very low. 6, 7% out of the entire population said we don't ascribe to a religion. And you notice since the 90s all the way until today, practically a linear increase from 6 to 9 to 12, all the way up until 23. We're probably at about 25% now in 2021, where almost 1 in 4 Americans do not ascribe to a religion. And so we have to think a lot. And I know these sessions over these 4 weeks are trying to unpack this, that I'm not saying this is caused because of science or scientism, but there are a number of different ideologies out there that have been working in tandem: liberalism, secularism, feminism, scientism, and many, many, many others that have led to a disenfranchisement with religion. And I have little doubt that there is a role of science in this, although it may not be as, how should I put this, not as pernicious or maybe as intentional as scientism or as scientists would like that to be a causal reason. And so let's start with definitions. I've said too much now about science and scientism. What do I mean by science, first of all? By science, what we're referring to is the intellectual tradition that is focused on understanding the natural world. And that's a super broad definition. And I'm using that broad definition because this is not something which is unique to the modern world. Ancient Greeks, much of Islamic history, especially between the 9th and the 15th centuries, and of course in the West post 17th century and beyond, have been heavily steeped, right, in the act of engaging in scientific inquiry. They've all had their own intellectual traditions that try to uncover the natural world. I'll be very clear, the word science itself and modern science, this is a term that came about pretty much in the late 16th, early 17th century, actually more into the middle of the 17th century and late 17th century, where it became the dominant way of describing the systematic study of the natural world. It used to be called before that natural philosophy, and I'll explain natural philosophy a little bit more in a few minutes. A more formal definition that science is the intellectual and practical activity that's encompassing the systematic study of structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. So that gives us that there's a method through it. The method is using human observation and as well as experimentation to arrive at understanding the structure and the behavior of the world that we're a part of. I want to shift in terms of saying there's a difference between science and natural philosophy as this ongoing thing that the world has been doing for hundreds and possibly thousands of years, talking about modern science, because this is really where our conversation will go today in terms of the role of modern science in warping into a philosophy of scientism and how that's influenced the world today. And so modern science refers to the advancements in the systematic study of the natural world from the 17th century onward. And most Western historians of science would say that the late 16th century was when modern science began to take shape, and the 17th century is when it began to really solidify. And so Copernicus in the late 16th century, the mid 16th century, with his theory of a heliocentric astronomy, that the universe did not revolve around the Earth, that he posited that the universe revolved around the sun. And then Johannes Kepler in 1609, when he put forth the laws of planetary motion, actually showing and demonstrating through observation that the planets orbit around the sun. But really it hit a peak with Galileo and kind of an inflection point in many ways between the relationship between science and religion kind of falling out when he was imprisoned due to championing Copernicus's views and developing them further out in showing that heliocentric astronomy was the better explanation rather than a geocentric explanation of the world. And Newton, of course, was also central in this in 1687 in outlining all of what we know about classical physics in terms of gravity, and all of his principles. So that just quickly tells us how the Western world has developed. I'll quickly just throw in here that Muslim scholars were heavily a part of this process, just in a parallel universe, because the West was oblivious to this. And as early as the 13th century, these modern developments in terms of heliocentric astronomy, planetary motion, so on and so forth, Muslim scholars were engaged in a lot of these same observations. Tusi in the 13th century was involved in making observations, and Ibn Shatir in the 14th century actually systematically would observe phenomena that Copernicus likely, they think, had some influence upon. And they say this because a lot of the models that he drew seemed to match very closely what Ibn Shatir had done. Nothing conclusive, but Ibn Shatir had used some really interesting observations that Copernicus might have built upon that really helped him outline his heliocentric theory. But Muslim scholars were challenging a lot of the dominant views of the Greeks, especially Ptolemy and his views about kind of how the world operated. So that's kind of where we get to, where is modern science? Modern science is this 17th century onward phenomena that was hallmarked by really astronomy and physics. And so now I walk back to saying, well, what is natural philosophy that happened the prior thousands of years or hundreds of years? And so natural philosophy is a term. And by the way, Galileo himself coined his own word, natural philosophy. So even though Galileo is looked at as one of the pioneers of modern science, he did not use the word modern. He did not use the word science. He used the word natural philosophy in describing what he was doing. So natural philosophy can be described as a philosophical study of nature and the physical universe. And that was dominant before the development of modern science. And it is considered to be the precursor of natural science. So natural philosophers, this is very, very important to distinguish them from modern day scientists, that natural philosophers saw themselves as uncovering the laws of God in the world. So natural philosophers, by the definition, of being philosophers themselves, who were often living in monotheistic societies, especially in a Western sense where Christianity was dominant, or in the Muslim world where, of course, Islam was dominant, they were religious and heavily influenced by religion, and saw religion as a motivator to uncover the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this universe. And so the assumption that natural philosophers worked underneath was that nature's structure is open to the human gaze and it is interpretable to the human mind. So there is a presupposition here that natural philosophers had, is that there is an intent out there somewhere that we have been designed in some ways to look at the universe and to understand it. And our mind is well suited to understand the complexities of the universe. So thus the universe has secrets to be unveiled by inquisitive minds. And you can think about some of the ayat in the Quran that support this, when Allah says, سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ وَلَمْ يَكْفِ بِرَبِّكَ أَنَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ شَهِيدٌ. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Fussilat that we will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that it is indeed the truth. But is it not sufficient concerning your Lord that He is over all things a witness? So this idea in the Quran is very, very clear that we are motivated to look to the heavens and the horizons and the celestial bodies above us, and of course deep within ourselves. That form of inquiry should lead to an increase in iman and lead to an increase in understanding the wisdom and the beauty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then of course acknowledging that He of course is sufficient, that we are not limited by looking at the heavens and the earth or our bodies to arriving at that truth, but that He alone of course is sufficient as a witness to the beauty of the universe. So I will now walk through a historical lesson. And by the way, please, I have noticed a chat there, and no one has said anything. Ask questions, ask if I need to stop and explain anything, I'm happy to. I have a lot to cover, so I know my time is tight, so I'm gonna go faster than I probably should. So I wanna do a quick history lesson now, that before we can jump into today's conflict with science and religion, or monotheism and religion, what is the history of how monotheistic religions and science operated together? And you will find a very beautiful history all the way until Galileo. And I hope this reframes how we think about the topic of science and religion, and removing this verses that is often put into the discourse today. So monotheism, and this is the premise, supported the development of science. That monotheism was actually a backbone by which natural philosophy and modern science developed. And so when you have an idea in the Quran that you'll see non-Muslims themselves reflecting over, أفلا يتدبرون القرآن ولو كان من عند غير الله لوجدوا فيه اختلافا كثيرا. And so the Nisa, Allah says that then do they not reflect over the Quran? If it had been from any other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning a monotheistic creator, then they would have found therein much contradiction. And this idea that it is impossible to have a coherent world, a coherent scripture, if there's numerous gods in the world, that you would find contradiction in the natural world if it was made by numerous gods that each had a role to play in the construction of it. And so from a Quranic angle, that's very clear, but let's look at it in a more general monotheistic perspective, that the existence of monotheism itself in the Islamic world and even in the Western world prevented the scientific consequences of polytheism. So from a polytheistic world, all mundane events in the world, whether it be rain, whether it be thunder, whether it be lightning, whether it be sickness, whether it be disease, whatever, if it would be a conflict between two people, they were often explained by the supernatural phenomena that was that the gods are angry and the gods are doing this and this is happening. And the idea that polytheism supports that there would be no structure in the universe because numerous gods cannot create one coherent, organized, consistent world. And so simply by the existence of monotheism in the Western and the Islamic world, the consequences of polytheism were unable to rise. And so the Quran, when we think about even a more straightforward verse, when Allah says, "Inna fi khalqi samawati wal ard wa ikhtilafi al-layli wan nahar wal fulki allati tajri fil bahri bima yanfa'u an-nas wa ma anzala Allahu min as-sama'i min ma'in fa ahya bihi al-arda ba'da mawtiha wa batha fiha min kulli dabbah wa tasrif ar-riyahi wa sahab al-musakhkhari bayna as-sama'i wal ardi la ayatin liqawmin ya'qilun." That's a lot in this verse. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us in this verse, and what Muslims understood from this is that there's a lot that is happening to think about. There is the creation of the universe itself and how that came to be, how the day and the night, they alternate one after another, how the ships, they sail through the ocean and all the benefits that mankind gets to this, how rain falls down in the sky and how plants, they grow from it, how animals move throughout the world, how the winds operate, and all of that. There are signs for people who are wise and who reflect. And so the Muslims understood, and from day one, developed their sciences by highlighting the repeated calls of the Quran to observe and to reflect upon these natural phenomena. And so the Muslim was motivated to say, I want to understand, how does this work? Where did the heaven and the earth come from? What were the laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put in place that allow the day and the night to alternate? How do the orbits work? What is the role of the earth in a solar system? Right? How does the rain work and the water cycle work? And all of these phenomena. How does wind work? How does air fly? How do planes take off? Of course, Muslims were involved very early in creating hang gliders and clocks and time. So the point is that there's more than enough religious motivation for Muslim scholars to engage without any sort of a conflict with science in the pursuit of uncovering the beauty of the universe. And so the presuppositions of monotheism are really, really important to really just let sink into our bodies for a minute. And so whether one was a Christian or a Muslim, and they're working in the Western or Eastern setting, these three presuppositions of monotheism were heavily influential in how they would engage in science. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being a rational lawgiver. When I say law here, I don't simply mean ahkam, that the Muslim or the human being, like laws of halal and haram, but I mean even natural laws. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He creates laws in the universe, right, that He's doing it with a certain intent, and that intent is meant to be understood, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is an omnipotent creator. That His ability to do, He can create any law He wants, whether it be a law for man to follow or a law in the universe. And these three presuppositions about Allah's omnipotence, Him being a rational lawgiver that's doing things with intentions that are meant to be understood, and there's a purpose behind what He legislates in the natural and in the scriptural world, lead to the idea for a scientist or from a natural philosopher that there exist in this world natural laws, that there is order to be represented in those laws that are intelligible to the human mind, and that nature is unified by those laws that are out there. And so what that leads to is that these ideas motivate the presuppositions of monotheism, scientific inquiry. And so you find that some of the early, the folks that modern science has been built upon, Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler, Newton, this has been found that they all believed that in studying the orderly process of nature, that they were uncovering God's rational design. So it's amazing that today you find that folks kind of champion them as the fathers of modern science, and they have disassociated them. They don't even understand that these individuals were motivated by many times by religious undertones and a monotheistic society. And so even this idea that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He's exalted because He has created and proportioned this world and determined it in such a precise manner, and then He has guided it. So if a Muslim really thinks about that, then there is this desire to appreciate Allah further by understanding the laws of the universe that Allah has put. And then we start to think about, I'll go quickly through a couple of things and we'll get to the conflict and where that comes from. So natural laws, they hold universally. So this is again what monotheistic and natural philosophers would posit. They hold universally. In other words, there's not a natural law that works in one part of the world and not another part of the world. They're interwoven in their operation. And likely they could be organized under some greater law. So even today, when you see atheist scientists who are trying to come up with a theory of everything, and for those who are in the, who are into, modern science, they know that a theory of everything refers to the attempt for a physicist in particular to come up with some sort of mathematical laws that can explain things at all levels. Because currently, classical physics and modern physics, right? Physics, they have not found one physical formula that operates both at the atomic level and even at the level of the cosmos. So at the atomic level, we have to use modern physics, right? And then we use classical physics for general phenomena in the world. So can we come up with some theory that puts all of this together? And the idea behind a theory that it can even put everything together was that there was structure in this universe that was meant to be uncovered. Yet today, many of those same scientists working on this don't even realize that. And so a single rational lawmaker is expected to work according to a unifying plan. And as Descartes even mentioned himself, we can expect a more perfect overall structure of organization for the various parts of a building on which one man alone has worked, rather than for a building whose construction has many masters. So even early on, he was saying this, that this structure in the universe is pretty clear. There has to be one creator rather than numerous creators, because then you wouldn't see the uniformity and the perfection of the design. And so this quote by John Brooke, I think, was very beautiful. He said, the very possibility of a rational science of nature is usually dependent on a uniformity in the relations between cause and effect. In the past, religious beliefs have served as a presupposition of the scientific enterprise insofar as they have underwritten that uniformity. Natural philosophers of the 17th century would present their work as a search for order in a universe regulated by an intelligent creator. A doctrine of creation could give coherence to scientific endeavor insofar as it implied a dependable order between the flux of nature. It's a heavy statement that summarizes pretty much everything we've spoken about in the last few minutes. So now we've gotten to the point that we say, okay, great, you're telling me that monotheism has supported the development of science. So what? Well, in turn, science actually supported monotheism. And this is a really important idea as well, because this goes into the harmony between the two of these historically. Because monotheism was, the presupposition of monotheism is that there's order in this universe. And the monotheism predicts that the world of nature will have features suggested by a monotheistic deity. And science began to, as the natural philosophers were in this work, they're finding evidence constantly that, sure enough, all the predictions of monotheism about unity, order, precision, and beauty were found. And even if you go into the details about the fine-tuning of the universe and the existence of the universe itself depended on such precision that it would not exist without it, science supports that there must have been a monotheistic deity that created the universe. So monotheism itself can claim support from science for its own claims. And so natural theology, which is the sister of natural philosophy. So of course, you didn't have to be religious to be a natural philosopher, but you were living in a monotheistic world that was promoting, a culture, I should say, that was promoting these laws, but natural theology that was saying that God is heavily in this process of uncovering the natural laws of the world held sway all the way from the 17th, 18th, and into the 19th century, pretty much until Darwinism came about, and other cultural events that actually created a really, really sharp schism between the two of these. And we'll get to that in a few minutes as well. And so I mentioned this already, but science itself limited the rise of polytheism, because as the ayah mentioned, it was put very nicely by Swinburne. He said, if there were more than one deity responsible for the order of the universe, we would expect to see characteristic marks of the handiwork of different deities in different parts of the universe, just as we see different kinds of workmanship in the different houses of a city. We would expect to find an inverse square law of gravitation obeyed in one part of the universe, and in another part a law that was just short of being an inverse square law, without the difference being explicable in terms of a more general law. So in other words, right, even the non-Muslim scientists, who are, many of them who are monotheists, would say that science again prevented these polytheistic consequences from ever being realized. So in conclusion, right, science supports monotheism, science keeps polytheism from rising, and the internalization of the universal laws of nature make polytheism unappealing. So today, even for in a Western context, when people are confused about the purpose of life and even theistic arguments, almost nobody would ever posit that polytheism is a tenable even solution to religion in the world today, because it completely goes against everything that they have found from an empirical standpoint in terms of explaining an organized world. So that gets us to now. So what happened? I'm arguing that monotheism supported science. Science actually gave more credence and support to monotheism. And then something happened. And that, like I mentioned, happened predominantly, it's a Christian problem. And this is when the Inquisition did not find Galileo to be in line with the aqidah of the Christian church. So he was found guilty of, and it was labeled as being vehemently suspect of heresy in 1633. And so he was sentenced to actual formal imprisonment by the Inquisition, but the next day it was commuted to house arrest for life. And so he died under house arrest. And the publication of any of his future works was forbidden, including any he might write in the future. So that was a mandate of the church during that time. And the statement they made was that, and again, so the church here had adopted a scientific position. This is an important point. The church adopted the position of Ptolemy, that we live in a geocentric universe. And because that became their aqidah, any scientific finding later on, right, was caused a conflict to them. So they said the sun lies motionless at the center of the universe, that the earth is not at its center and moves, and that one may hold and defend an opinion as probable after it has been declared contrary to Holy Scripture. This is what Galileo was guilty of. And he was mandated to recant, and he didn't, and so he was guilty. So this is where the first real conflict happened in the modern world between religion and science, and you could say it's between Christianity and science. Of course, we did not find this in the Muslim world, so this is not the same issue. I think there's a question, so I'll quickly look at this. I thought a question that someone could bring up. What if it is said that there are multiple gods who have a council and they work very well together, and that is why there aren't any differences in their handiwork? So yeah, that definitely could be posited. So from a scientific perspective, number one, and even from a common sense perspective, human beings are always looking for parsimony in explaining phenomena. So every theory that a scientist puts out, and even a religious scholar, we're looking for underlying principles that are as parsimony is another way of saying as elegant as possible and as straightforward and as interpretable as possible. So yes, one could come up with a convoluted story, but is it parsimonious? And is it more tenable and more likely than one God who created the universe? And so while you could say it's plausible that multiple gods did this, one could, let's just say for the sake of argument, we give them that as a possibility. We would say, how much more unlikely is that than there being one creator, right, who would do all this in such an organized fashion? The question is, why was the church so adamant about this position? The church was adamant about it because they had adopted Ptolemy's views and their own reading of their scripture. And of course, the Bible itself, full of its errors over time in terms of its transmission, the authenticity behind it. They themselves had such confusion over what the scripture was saying, and so they just adopted Ptolemy's views of the geocentric universe as fundamentally something which you could not deviate from. So I don't know exactly the development of how that came about, but for whatever reason, that in the 16th and 17th centuries was such severe, heavy doctrine that they could not tolerate it. Although I will say that there were popes. The Pope at the time of Copernicus was actually very interested and supportive of Copernicus's research. And what happened in the subsequent years between that Pope and Galileo coming out, I'm not exactly sure. It's something I should probably look deeper into in the future. But even the point is that the church wasn't anti-science. The church knew that in scientific inquiry that they were finding support for monotheism. And so there was really no conflict, which is why they're willing to support scientists in many ways. It's only when Galileo really pushed this and there began to be a concern that, wow, this man is now observationally undermined the core aqidah of our place in the universe, in the cosmos, that they really had this knee-jerk reaction, which I think should give us as Muslims a little bit of pause. And I'll get to that later in my talk, that when should we have this, if we have a knee-jerk reaction to a scientific opinion that's out there, and it's plausible that it's true, do we now put all of Islam under scrutiny in terms of one scientific position that we have an issue with? That do people now willing to throw all of Islam out? And it's a really, really tough answer, and I don't have an answer for it, but we'll talk about it at the end, as that's really probably the biggest concern in the current day for theologians and scholars of tafsir, and even fuqaha, in thinking about how should we respond to scientific positions that oppose scripture. And I will outline it and suggest some principles that we might operate under. So we now go to, so this all outlines, so monotheism and Christianity, there was harmony between them for centuries. They supported one another. Christianity in the 17th century had a kind of this knee-jerk reaction that really set into motion a conflict between scientists, right, and between religion in the Western world. And that begs the question, is that why did science become so appealing? And I want to, I like the statement again by Bruce, one of the historians of science. He says, the idea that science would displace religion in a zero-sum contest to explain the world is largely a red herring. So, and I agree with this, that in terms of the idea that science is going to replace religion in terms of being able to, there's a zero-sum game between them, that either it's science or it's religion, and that one will replace the other. It's a false dichotomy, because the history has shown that that's never the case, that they always operate in tandem. But contrary to the expectation of liberal theologians and advocates of the higher criticism of the 1890s, in other words, evolutionary biologists in particular, modern people seem quite capable of believing all sorts of twaddle, as he calls it, right? Witness of the popularity of alien abduction stories or theories of racial superiority. In other words, people can be non-scientific all the time. But this is a really important point. Insofar as science does impact faith, it is through technology. And this is his point. This is not a value judgment. This could be good or bad in terms of technology giving us a sense that we are masters of our fate. Medieval peasants quite reasonably saw themselves as being of no significance in the eyes of either their worldly masters or of their creator. Modern Western consumers think rather highly of themselves. They choose their microwaves, they choose their governments, and they choose which God to believe in and in what manner. So in other words, what he's saying here, and what I will argue as well, is that this is not an issue of science versus religion alone. It has to do with a number of philosophies that are operating in tandem. So that statement, you could apply that same statement for liberalism, as Dr. Ovamir must have spoken about in detail, right? And even in feminism and even in secularism, that this issue of the autonomy of the individual, right? The choice of the individual to live according to certain values that they want, that choice is very central. So science gives human beings a whole lot more choice, and it gives them a whole lot more audacity to feel like they are in charge of their lives, and to really discount and to eliminate the role of God in their life. So again, it's not saying that there is no God. It's not saying that science is doing away with God, but it's saying that the role of God becomes less and less salient in a technological context. And so I'll walk through that now, and also in the end, I'm going to come back to this, because the appeal of modern science, that's different than, when I say modern science, I mean really, really modern science now, like, talking about 21st century science, is that we interact with modern science every single day. Whereas you can call Galileo and Copernicus and Kepler and even the other folks in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, you can call them modern scientists. But their science was very distant. Like, do you interact with heliocentric astronomy on a regular basis? Does it impact your life, whether the world revolved around Earth or the sun? It's very distant, and it really is not proximal to your daily mindset. Or even nuclear physics, what the nature of an atom, the nature of an electron, right, and quantum mechanics. It's, who cares? For 99.9% of people in the world, it has absolutely no role in your day-to-day life that you draw into consciousness. Of course it does in terms of technology you use, but it's so distant. But when it comes to modern science in the 21st century, statistics in particular and other things, we've absorbed the explanatory power of science and rely upon it continuously. So in the past, before the advent of modern science, when they would see phenomena in the world, they would chalk it up to, this is from the wisdom of Allah. This is from God's power. Eclipse, even in Islam, when there was a solar eclipse, right, and a lunar eclipse, the Prophet Muhammad explained that rather than this be something, that is, there's nothing superstitious about this. It's not rising, it's not eclipsing because of the death of his son, right? But this is just a taqdeer of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? This is just the natural law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But that's still just saying, I don't know how the eclipse works. But now we can say, well, I know exactly how the eclipse works. And we can mathematically give you the orbit around which the solar and the lunar eclipses work, right? We can tell you and predict when they're going to happen in the future with a lot of precision and accuracy, almost down to the minute and the second. And so that explanatory power for disease, right, and how contagion works, right, how COVID works, all of these things give people a tremendous amount of confidence in what modern science can do. Medical care, in terms of regulating things, modern technology you mentioned, and that we can come back to what I mean by modern technology, but I literally mean from every gadget you use every single day, that the feeling you have that you are in control of your life. So, and as Steven Pinker, who's probably one of the stupidest guys in the world. I mean, this is a man who generally, constantly, I don't care if he's a Harvard professor, says things that are completely out of left field. And this is something what you find with academics who really ascribe to scientific naturalism or scientism, as I'll define in a minute. He says this absurd statement: science has granted us the gifts of life, health, wealth, knowledge, and freedom. Like, what does that even mean? Science has not gifted anybody anything. But what he is trying to get at here, and really trying to subtly shift the mind of people, is saying technology has given us time to live how we want to live. And what he explains in his explanation, what he gets into is saying, look, we used to spend a ton of time in the past getting water, washing our clothes. Even 50 years ago and 60 years ago, the typical household, the amount of time it took to do chores was intense. And he goes, now modern science, with all of the gadgets it's created for us, has given us the time to do what we want to do. And of course, that's a there's a value judgment in that. But what he means, he goes, if you want to have social ties, you have more time for socializing, you have time to read, you can sit on the couch and watch Netflix, but whatever you want to do, because you, as a liberal, autonomous being, should be given that the pinnacle of success is you having the chance to live life out the way you want to. Technology has given you that right. And so science in this way, not in terms of saying there's no God. And I want to be really clear about this. It's not that science is saying there's no God, but science in this way challenges a cultural status of monotheism in society. So in other words, it renders that God may exist, but we can explain everything else without God. So sure, God created the sun and the moon, but I can tell you in more scientific detail how they operate. And sure, God, he created all the elements in the world, but I can tell you how they work together to give us X, Y, and Z in the world. And I can harness their power in making your life better in a tangible way by which you have now come to love and respect the scientist and his work and his craft far more than the craft of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that seems very distant to you. And that is why when you pull out your phone, you're constantly reminded of, and you're in awe of Steve Jobs and of Apple, and you drive your Tesla, and you're in awe of Elon Musk and the engineers who create these amazing gadgets, because you interact with those gadgets every single day. Whereas the human beings of a century before, despite the fact there was phenomenal science being done, they were not every day in awe of that, because it wasn't giving them an experience that they were like, my life is substantially better and more influenced by this. So we can stop at this now and get into now, what in the world is scientism? And there's a question, so let's come to that real fast. Are we talking about science as it's subjectively framed by those participating therein? Or are you saying science is objectively set up like this? So yeah, I'm going to get into all this. So let's now get into what I mean by all this. So right now, what I was speaking about is science is, we go back to our definition. It is a method of inquiry that is meant to, it is using observation and experimentation to understand the natural world and how it works. That's what it means. There's no value in the definition of science in and of itself, other than saying there is order in the natural world, and that's the presupposition. And science allows, and we operate under that premise to make sure that we can use those laws to uncover phenomena, right? That's what we're saying. Now, the framework as to what the role of that is and the natural consequence of scientism is where it gets very, very dicey, and we're going to get the rest of our time we'll go into. I know actually we don't have a lot of time. We have till 2:15, right? So okay, so 25 minutes, I think. Okay, so let's jump into this. So what in the world is scientism now? So scientism is the view that the sciences alone provide, they can only provide genuine knowledge of reality. Whereas previously in the definition of science does not say that. Science is simply saying this is a way of uncovering information about the natural world. We use observation and experimentation, and that helps us learn about the natural world. That's it. It doesn't say there's not other knowledge out in the world. It doesn't say there's other sciences and tools and methodologies of acquiring information. But scientism is very clear in saying that only the hard sciences are capable and able to provide genuine knowledge of reality. And so scientific knowledge is thus vastly superior to any other form of knowledge. And so now a deeper definition is scientism is the belief. And again, it's the difference between science is not a belief. Science is a method of understanding the world. Scientism is an aqidah. It is the belief that science, especially natural science, is the most valuable part of human learning because it is the most authoritative, serious, or beneficial. And so what is crucial to scientism as a philosophy, and I'm saying that very clearly, scientism is a philosophy. It is not in identifying something as scientific or unscientific. That's not what matters to them as much. But it is in the thought that the scientific is substantially more valuable than the non-scientific. And so science thus can, for the one who believes in methodological scientism, is the only paradigm of truth and rationality. So that's what we mean here by scientism. We're talking about an aqidah that imposes that the scientific method is the absolute only way that one will gain deep knowledge about the world. And all other forms of knowledge, whether they be religion, philosophy, those are all simply either invalid or supremely inferior, to the point that they're only valid when they can conform with what science would tell them. And this is where the problem lies. The problem doesn't lie in science, and the problem doesn't lie in being a scientist. The problem lies in one believing in scientism, because there are some deep consequences of scientism, and there are cultural reasons why scientism has become the cultural air that we breathe. And by the way, scientism is not a popular belief in the world. Actually, they've done some really interesting studies trying to understand this. So even what I showed you with 1 in 4 people in the US who claim that they don't follow religion, they don't believe in scientism. They're not atheists per se. They just don't believe in organized religion. And out of that 1 in 4, many of them believe in God, and many of them believe that there's a higher purpose in this life. They just don't feel like they have found an organized religion that tells that to them. So when the scientific community tries to use that as look, everyone is abandoning religion. Yes, they might be abandoning organized religion, but not running to scientism. And some of the numbers that have been found say a max, they say, of 5% right, of the Western population, at least the American population, could be classified as believing in scientific naturalism, which is it's quite small, right? So, but the point again, it's not the prevalence of the belief that matters, it's the consequence of that in the air that matters. So even if, you know, the majority of the country is Christian and believe in God, the question is, so what? If their belief in God has no consequence on their day-to-day life in terms of how they live their life, in terms of what they believe about the world, and it's just this compartmentalized, you know, part that, oh yeah, I believe in God and I put him in a place and I invoke him at certain times and places, but he does not permeate in everything I see in the world, then it's really a very limiting value in terms of being a theist. So scientism, a few issues that pop up. So number one, and scientism itself will tell you this, science can never explain the very existence of the universe. So it cannot explain the why for anything, because that goes beyond the definition of science, because you cannot observe the why and you cannot experiment to come up with the why. So in other words, there's no, they call it a teleological argument. So there's no reasoning and wisdom as to why the universe is the way it is. All they can tell you is this is what we can explain how it works. Why it works this way, that's outside the realm of science. So it's important to know the limit of science itself, what scientism does acknowledge. However, this is not important if culturally science explains what humans want to have explained. So if the scientific community, by scientists, even if they're religious or if they're not religious, if they simply push an agenda that, you know what, sure, you can have any of your own religious views, whatnot, but culturally, all that matters to people is that can science explain what we want to have explained? So tell me about how the planets work. Tell me about how the natural world works. And you can show me enough laws and principles, and you can derive enough utility for the human being. They'll say that, who cares about the why? I've got my reason as to how it works, so the why is no longer consequential. And this is why, instead of a single deity who creates a universe, it posits a single reality. This is what scientism does. God is subtracted, so he's irrelevant. Not that he doesn't exist, he's irrelevant because we cannot observe him directly, we cannot experiment to show his existence. And so only the universe remains. And this view allows science, at least in principle, to explain everything. I think this is an important point, is that it's not denying the existence of God necessarily. It's simply saying that this is outside of the field of inquiry. So even if he exists, we can never know. And so we might as well remove him from the equation of understanding the world because it has no value. And so the scientific method will explain everything of value, and thus it becomes the only knowledge that we can have any truth that we can ascribe to it. And the consequence is that the agnostic then, anyone who's agnostic in the society, no longer is concerned with God's existence or why the universe was created. So you have many people. I meet people every day in my, in the university setting, talk to them. It's like, yeah, it's like the question of whether or not God exists and whether the universe has a reason is not even in their mind. It's like, I don't know. I have no idea and I don't think about it. And that is a consequence of modern science in many ways and of scientism really being in the air that's around us. Where does new atheists fit into this? We'll come to that in a bit. No, new atheists are actually going to be hardly believers in scientific methodologicalism. Yeah, I'm twisting my words. In scientism. In other words, saying that there is no God. They extrapolate from this. And this is where we said scientism is a philosophy. It's not a science. Let's unpack that a bit. So this is why Bertrand Russell, right, one of the most famous scholars of the Western world in the last century, he said, I should say that the universe is just there, and that's all. And so he was an atheist, and he was simply saying that that's all that matters, is that the universe is there. Why it's there, irrelevant completely. And so when you have these scientists who are at the peak of influencing society saying these type of statements, it becomes a cultural air that everyone breathes. And so now you find, for instance, that 73% of philosophers, is a study that was done, deny the existence of God. And this gets to 2 points, is that when we're talking about scientism, so here I go back to my definition, it is the belief that the that science is the most valuable part of human learning because it is the most authoritative, serious, or beneficial. That's a general statement about scientism, but we can break it into two buckets. And those two buckets are strong scientism, that says science is the absolutely only path to knowledge and truth, and that's where the new atheist would fit in. And then you have the weak scientism, which is what most Christians of today probably fall into as well. That there are other ways of knowledge are tolerated, but they are far inferior to science. So 5% of the population might be in the strong scientism camp, but I'd argue that the majority of other Americans and Westerners likely fall into the weak scientism camp. That they say, yeah, it's not the only way to know about the world, but it is the peak and the most, it is the most trusted way of understanding the world. So whether you're strong or weak is actually irrelevant because the consequences are actually quite similar. And that's what we'll unpack for the last 15 minutes. So what are the consequences of scientism, weak or strong? So scientism puts Islam and actually all religions outside of the plausibility structures of a society. And by plausibility structure, right, I'm referring to, the socio-cultural context that one lives in that is able to even, it's what gives people the possibility of what even could be believed and done. In other words, all the beliefs that people hold, all the meanings that people hold, they are supported by all the different sociocultural institutions that they're a part of. So when schools and the workplace, the universities, all the different settings and the environments that people are in, scientism is such a prevalent way of seeing the world that religion is not even able to operate in those spaces. So for instance, all of us who are deeply committed Muslims, if we're scientists or we're the university, right, or if we're in our workplace, religion has been relegated to not being something which is discussed there. It is no longer considered valued information. You could put forth all kinds of scientific ideas. You could talk about string theory all you want at school or at the workplace, right, or in the academy. And again, string theory, right, as a way of explaining the universe is not something which has got this deep, rigorous, mathematical explanation that is truth. It is a theory out there, but it is a belief about how the universe worked. You can have a scientifically oriented belief, something which is in the bucket of science, but it's not science. It's not truth. You could have it discussed in these settings, but religious arguments and religious values are outside of those realms completely. So no one can raise their hand in a class and say, well, I know you said that, but the Bible says this, the Quran says that. Or even in the workplace, you can't say that. And you can't say that, of course, in an academic publication. If any of us who publish, you try to write in your publication, a verse or a Bible verse or a Quranic verse or a hadith as evidence in a scientific piece, it'll get thrown out, right? So plausibility structures set a framework for what people think, which affects how they're willing to listen, evaluate, feel, and behave. So even the ability to think about religious arguments begins to become a knee-jerk reaction to people that's not really what we do. We don't operate with that as a piece of evidence in our spaces. Not because it's an invalid piece of evidence, because it's not valued as much as a scientific piece of evidence would be. I'll be very honest, in my own work that I do, and it's something I deal with every single day, I try to empirically show how Islamic beliefs and practices are beneficial to people. And you could think about something like even fasting. People, of course, now the literature is replete, the scientific literature, that intermittent fasting is good for people. And now one could say, see, look, proof, intermittent fasting is good. And now all these Muslims, they feel really proud and happy that, see, my religion is true, which gets at, man, it's just there really is that complex that's deep within the hearts that I didn't really believe that fasting was this amazing thing. I knew God told me to do it, so I do it. But when science told me that it was good, I feel so much better about myself. And that's what I mean by it's in the air that we're all operating underneath. I operate under this and you operate underneath it. And we're all, unfortunately, trying to gasp, for wahi. But, the smoke, right, of scientism is all around us. And so, unfortunately, it's a tool that we even use today and try to get people to get closer towards scripture and towards faith, to say, look, even the current plausibility structure that you believe in of science supports these religious findings. So it is a dicey thing to work with, because what happens when science doesn't conform to scripture? And so it's a double-edged sword that we need to think very carefully about. Of course, the consequences of scientism makes mocking religion completely acceptable. Right? That if it's no longer a valued piece of knowledge, a way of accepting the truth, of coming to the truth, then making fun of it and ridiculing it is completely fine. Which is what if you were to ridicule science, right? They have marches a few years ago, the March for Science, right? And there's all of these all over the country where it's like when science is under attack, it's like this deep problem that we've got to get out and march and show people that science matters. But making fun of religion, right? It's not a big deal, right? And that just shows you the extent of the hypocrisy when people march in defense of their faith. It's like, look at these religious zealots. When people march in defense of science, it's like, look at these enlightened individuals, promoting, the right way to live. So the cultural shifts related to scientism are very subtle and very dangerous. Again, weak or strong. So scientism in the air creates a shift from knowledge to blind faith, meaning religious knowledge. So whereas once religious knowledge was viewed as rooted in facts, it's rooted in evidence that could be debated, right? It could be proven or disproven. Religious knowledge now, religious claims are no longer in the realm of the factual, nor are they subject to rational evaluation. And in some of the books I was reading, there's really good anecdotes where they show you how this operates. So I remember in the book I was reading, Oprah Winfrey, after 9/11, when she's on her show, she gets on her show and she wants to provide comfort to the American population. And she says to everybody, at this time, everyone turn to whatever it is you believe in, whatever God it is that you believe in, whether it's a he, whether it's a she, whether it's this, and she goes on to pretty much say that whatever you believe in, go and find comfort and solace in this. And what is that? When she says that statement on national TV and there's millions of viewers who are watching it, the cultural paradigm in that is what? It's that religious knowledge, religious claims are just subjective things, right? There's really no truth behind it. So go whatever you want to go worship and whatever's going to make you feel better, just go and do it, right? And so your religious tradition is just blind faith. It has nothing to do with, you would never say that about something objective, right? No one would say whether you believe in electrons or neutrons or protons, whatever it is, of course not. Because the consequence of believing in one form of atomic theory versus another is pretty intense in terms of how you could do science. But when it comes to how religion influences your life, it's this completely subjective blind faith thing. So where even Christians say it's a leap of faith to believe in these things at times. Not all Christians, and a lot of Christians now are actually pushing back a lot and saying this de-intellectualizing Christianity has put the church in a really, really deep hole where it's not appealing now to the young congregants. And so the second shift from religious knowledge from knowledge to blind faith is from seeking truth in life to satisfying desires. And this is heavily related to liberalism, secularism, and feminism. So that either there is no purpose in life or we have no way of determining it. So the hard scientism, strong scientism says there practically is no purpose in life because there's nothing else other than that we can measure. But the weak scientism will say that there's no way of actually determining it in many ways. And so that shift is actually very serious. And that shifts again from an ethics of positive duty and virtue to a do no harm minimalism. So whereas in a religious paradigm, there is a moral duty, right? There are virtues that we aspire towards, but in a paradigm where that doesn't exist anymore, it's do no harm minimalism. And so what that means is that we should be tolerant of all moral viewpoints because none of them are objectively better than the other. The transcendence of the individual over the community, individual autonomy becomes the highest good. And when it comes to contracts, all that matters is informed consent. That's really what they push as voluntary informed consent is what matters rather than some covenant-based marriage that's archaic that we're operating under, that Christians and Muslims operate under. And so the principle that underlies all of this is one may morally act in any way one chooses, so long as one does not do harm to others, because that's the principle that they have decided is objective, is harm, which of course that's subjective anyway, but they have arbitrarily chosen that as their objective principle, and everything else you can do. And no one can argue and say that this is better than that. So if you think that worshiping a chicken is moral to you, then by all means do it. If you think that, what else? There's really interesting studies that have shown cross-cultural differences to prove this point. Well, look, in India, for instance, when in Hindu culture, some of them, it's like a huge crime to eat meat or to like show your what is it? If your husband dies, like you can't eat meat for a certain number of days, right? Or like you know, being around your brother-in-law, right, is a certain crime in certain settings. Like they have all these odd rules, but the cross-cultural literature has shown that, to say, look at how subjective morality is, right? None of these are based in any sort of objective harm or principles. And so the last shift is a shift from a classical understanding, a shift from a classical to a contemporary notion of freedom. So a classical notion of freedom would say that one has the power to do what one ought to do. So to be classically free, right, means that you exercise your self-restraint to be chaste until you get married. This is even where you find Hind, right, what she said, you know, when she was coming into Islam, to the Prophet Muhammad SAW, was explaining to her the rules of entering into Islam, and recited to her, right, the verses from Surah Al-Mumtahina about not committing zina. And she responds, "Oh, it doesn't hurra." You know, it doesn't hurra. Like, what kind of a free woman would commit zina? In her own polytheistic world that she came from, she still had a notion of classical freedom, which is like, you know, we have a power to exercise certain moral mandates that we have. And so a free woman to commit zina is something very, very lowly. And that was classical freedom. But in a contemporary world, they've reframed that to be one has the power to do whatever one wants to do. So the immediate gratification of their sexual desires is an example, right? So yes, Dr. Tahsin said Pluto's a planet. Oops, sorry, it's not, right? You know, so this gets into the issue of what's up?
Related to the Pluto's a planet, there was a comment above a few points back about the problem of using science to justify or support religious practice and or scripture, is that we will tend to forget that scientific facts can change with time. What is true scientifically today may be deemed heresy or superstition in some decades. And I think that was with respect to, I believe, your comment about, well, even Islamic practices can be empirically supported.
Yeah, okay. So we can unpack that a bit and we'll get to it more. So one is that in the case where there's congruence, there's no issue. So for instance, if Islam says gratitude is good, and we know that it says that, and there's numerous ayat and a hadith and, you know, a tradition of 1400 years that says that gratitude is good. And then, you know, like I just done recently, I did a study to measure gratitude and well-being and all these things, and I find that Muslims who are grateful are having better all kinds of outcomes. So for me to say that science says that gratitude is good, it's of no concern to me whether or not it's falsifiable, because the faith already told me that it's the truth. So that the concern of when we use science to support anything is if that is something which scripture has not yet deemed as truth. And we'll get into the levels of that. And to quickly answer is that if there's something which is qat'i, absolute in Islam as a truth, science can only support it and solidify it, right? But if something in Islam is either a dhanni or even unknown as truth, and then science says that this is the truth, at that point we need to be careful about ascertaining it as a truth, because if it's falsifiable and in 20 years it's falsifiable and we attribute it to Islam, now you can create the problems that we saw even with the church, right? So that's where we get into the hierarchy of talking about how do we use science and religion together, and what are the rules around that. So I want to mention for a few minutes, and I have 2 minutes, but I'm probably going to go over a bit. Again, how did we get here? Quickly, the modern university is huge in this case. To just a quick walkthrough, right? About 130 years ago, 140 years ago, Harvard itself, its seal included this idea of truth for Christ and the church. This idea was embedded in the universities in the early 19th century, that imparting wisdom and knowledge and the spiritual development of a person was central to the mission of university. Like, you do not go through university unless you're being trained in akhlaq and in tarbiyah and so on and so forth, because it was a mandate, right, of the school to doing this. And then we see in the scientific stage in the kind of in the beginning of the 20th century, where they kind of created this fact value distinction, that all religious things are in the value of subjective beliefs, whereas everything scientific is in the realm of facts. And so religion became something private and subjective, and they actually then kicked out religion from the mandate of the universities, put it sometimes in the humanities. And then what interestingly had to happen was that before, in a university, you would go and there was this notion, and most universities were Christian, that you're being apprenticed into being a godly person. But once religion gets kicked out, well, how do you find a sense of unity in a university? What is the purpose of being there? And so the ethical and the religious training became outsourced to extracurricular, because it's no longer the core part of the university. And then they actually had to replace the morality that they're trying to inculcate in a university with just school morale. That's why you see things like clubs that pop up at schools. You would see school spirit being posited. You see college athletics. So there's an entire kind of philosophy that underlies why does a modern university operate the way it does? Why are some of us today who are on this call, if I say UCLA versus USC, if you went to either of those schools, you have a very strong reaction that you love one over the other. It has nothing to do with the academics there. There's something about the affiliation that the universities have realized is important, because we're human beings with a desire to belong, and we find meaning in belonging to somebody and to some group. So as before, you would say, well, I want to belong to a place where the belief system is one which I connect with. Now that has been replaced with simply, I like the sports team, right? I like the colors, right? Whatever it might be, it's something superficial that has replaced, the sense of what you derive from the university as a place of connection. And so there's a lot to get into the modern university, but the fact that most professors are not religious, scientism is the air that you breathe in the university every single day. Unless you're in religious studies, you can't really talk about religion. There's data to show that religious beliefs are substantially altered in the university setting. And I don't mean abandoned, because it's not about abandoning religion. It's about the shift that occurs. And so the shift is that all the supernatural beliefs begin to be reinterpreted. So there's been a lot of studies that show that Christians, they don't leave Christianity, but their belief in like angels and other supernatural entities, that decreases quite a bit. And there's a lot of other stuff in the modern university. There's literature on it that shows how do modern universities erode religiosity, but not eliminate it altogether. And so I'm going to end because of my time. I'm going to skip tolerance. I'm going to skip this. I didn't need to get to this. Is important. So I want to end by saying scientism is self-refuting. This is what we have to end on, like a few slides. Maybe I'll go an extra 10 minutes. Self-refuting statements, what I mean by that is they don't just happen to be false. I'm not saying scientism, I believe scientism is false. It is by definition necessarily false. And the way we talk about a self-refuting statement is that the claim it's making establishes some requirement of acceptability, that the claim places itself in subjection to this requirement, and then that the claim falls short of satisfying the statement that it's the requirement that is put forth. So let's walk through this. So scientism believes that only what is testable by science can be true. That is the aqidah of scientism. So now we're going to say, okay, that is a self-refuting statement. Because does this statement establish a requirement of acceptability? Yes. It says that something must be testable to be true. Does the statement place itself in subjection to the requirement? Yes, because it purports to convey the truth. But does the statement fall short of satisfying its own requirement? Yes, because this is a philosophical statement about science that cannot itself be tested by science. So there's no experiment that I could run. There is no observation that I can do that can prove that only what is testable by science can be true. That is an impossible assertion by the definition of science. So scientism has refuted its own belief system, right? This is a really, really important thing that we don't want to get caught up with the new atheists do when they get into all these things and they try to walk you through, their own logic. It's like, sorry, bro, stop. Tell me your belief, okay? Your belief is self-refuting. It is a philosophy, and you have told me that philosophy is junk. You have told me this philosophy is not a path to getting at the truth. But your presupposition of scientism is a philosophy. So I'm sorry, I'm not even going to argue with you about the details, right? It's junk. It would be like someone who if I wrote a book and I said, this is wahi from Allah, right? And in there, I have a statement that I put in there. And I said, let's argue over the truth of this statement. I'd say, why am I going to argue with the truth of the statement? The whole enterprise is bogus, right? I don't believe in the scripture to begin with. No one believes in the scripture. It's a bunch of trash. So why am I going to argue about one premise in the book? There's no arguing the premises of scientism because it in itself is self-refuting, right? Let's show that a little bit deeper. So number one, it is a philosophical belief. It is not a scientific claim. Strong scientism is a philosophical assertion that claims that philosophical assertions are neither true nor can be true, right? Only scientific assertions can be true and known, right? So again, that shows the absurdity of the statement. To claim that philosophical assertions are bogus, yet to be founded on a philosophical assertion, right? So this statement I thought was beautiful. Scientism is a belief for which there can be no sufficient scientific or empirical evidence either. There is no way without circular thinking to set up a scientific experiment to demonstrate that every true proposition must be based in empirical evidence rather than faith. The censoring of every instance of faith in the narrow new atheist sense of the term would have to include the suppression of scientism also. Moreover, the claim that truth can be attained only by reason and science functioning independently of any faith is itself a false claim, a faith claim, and a false claim. Complete consistency would require that the new atheist world of thought be cleansed of scientism and scientific naturalism as well. Those are pretty much synonymous, right? So that's the easiest way to refute a new atheist who believes that only science is a path to truth. They say that is a philosophical claim that in and of itself it is false. And now why is it false? Let's go through some of these. Let me, because of time, jump a bit. So here's a few points that are important now, because I don't want us to lose the baby with the bathwater. Science is different than scientism. So it is one thing to celebrate science for its achievements and its remarkable ability to explain a wide variety of phenomena in the natural world. But to claim there's nothing knowable outside the scope of science would be similar to a successful fisherman saying that whatever he can't catch in his net does not exist. Okay? So it's the actual tool of science is a tool that cannot catch what religion and other sources of knowledge are giving you. So it's not that science, it's a certain metric, right? And I have to give an even more crude analogy. It's a scale by which one can measure certain things, but scales have their limits. And so a scale that's used to measure like jewelry, right, cannot measure, for instance, like things that weigh in the order of tons, right? It's just, the scale is not broken. It's just unable to measure that. It's outside of its scope. And so scientism, right, it is the outside of its scope, right, to get into these greater issues of life. It can neither prove it, right? And so it has no ability to deny and to make that assertion that truth cannot be found, right, other than with science. Once you accept that science is the only source of human knowledge, you've adopted a philosophical position that cannot be verified or satisfied by science itself. Scientism is in itself unscientific. The health of science is in fact jeopardized by scientism, not promoted by it. And this is, again, going through, there's a lot of physicists who believe this, physicists who believe, right? At the very least, scientism provokes a defensive, immunological, aggressive response from other intellectual communities. In return for its own arrogance and intellectual bullyism, it taints science itself by association. So I'll end with two things. I keep saying that. But here are the four presuppositions of science, some of them. A world exists out there, independent of mind, language, or theory. The nature of the world is orderly, including its deep structure. Objective truth exists, and our sensory and cognitive faculties are reliable for gaining truth. Those, again, are not testable assertions. These are all the presuppositions of science, or even the laws of logic and mathematics exist to say that. So all of these are presuppositions of science. Science cannot justify these presuppositions, but philosophy can, if you believe in philosophy, or scripture can. Science cannot be stronger than its presuppositions, and that's an important point. Something that is the consequence of something else cannot be stronger than its presupposition. And so scientism thus disproves itself, right? And there's a lot we can get into with the limits of science. I won't go into all of it, but something that was mentioned, what I think is worth mentioning, is that science in and of itself is the argument that any scientist would make, not someone who believes in scientism, but a scientist, is that it is constantly changing and its findings are updated. So the current perspective is acknowledged to not be the absolute truth on any issue. And that's why there's a whole field of superseded scientific theories. Over time, as the science of a particular area moves on, it is often the case that older views of some entity are abandoned. And in light of the current theory, scientists no longer believe there are ever such things. And this is, again, an important thing. When people talk about, I believe in science, you say, what science do you believe in? Do you believe in the history of science or just today's science? Because you've abandoned everything else that you don't even realize you've abandoned, and you think that the scripture of science today is all that exists. And 100 years from now, the scientist, the person who believes in scientism, will have abandoned everything of the last 100 years. And so here's a really good example for those who are into physics, even the history of an electron, right? We likely, all of us here, believe there's something called an electron, not because the Quran said it, right? We likely believe in it because there's a lot of scientific evidence around it. But the history of an electron itself, it's completely, there's errors left and right. So over the last century and a half, there's been numerous views from the person who discovered them, Thomson, to Niels Bohr, right, to even currently. And so we've dumped all the old theories of an electron. So does that mean that none of that was, like, what do we say about all of that? And what does that mean about our current knowledge of the electron, where it's going to be in 100 years? And so I'll stop there. I just think I've covered a lot, and there's things that rationality we can get into. There's teleology. I still have a lot more, but I'll stop because of anything else. Actually, I didn't get into uncertainty. So should I talk about uncertainties yet, or should I open it up?
Let's go ahead and open it up. Something I have a feeling that some of the questions might just touch on that, inshallah.
Okay. Yeah, bismillah. Let's open it up.
Barakallah feek. Thank you for the hard stop. Okay. So our first question. What are some assumptions that proponents of scientism take for granted? Since you mentioned there are, right, scientism is a philosophical belief, as an example.
What are some of the assumptions? Yeah, so those are all the presuppositions I spoke about, right? So these statements right here are all things that scientism it actually has to depend upon for it to exist. They have to say that there's a world that exists out there that's independent of mind, language, and theory. And by the way, that's not agreed upon by everybody. There are religions out there and philosophies out there that say that this is not true, right? That many Eastern philosophies, they share that. So just to have that as your assertion that you build science on, but that itself is not something which you can test. So even if we said we're all living in a simulation, which again, Elon Musk, he believes in that, right? He believes that we're living in a simulation. And many other people, they believe in this, right? Well, that's not something which and he himself says you can't test that, but they believe it, right? Well, that's a philosophy that you're believing in. And so it's not science. Objective truth exists rather than everything being subjective. There is a deep structure to the world. All that can only be proven by philosophy or by religion. And so this is why scientism is self-refuting.
Okay, the next question is, you mentioned that science not only displaced religion from an explanatory perspective, but even a cultural one. For example, intimate aspects such as choosing one's microwaves, LED lights, etc. How do we posit Islam in a cultural way, whether as individuals, parents, community, or even in the socio-political space?
Oh man, that's a heavy question. Maybe there I should jump into uncertainty because I think it goes through this. Let's come back to technology a bit. I'll be honest, I don't have an answer for that because it is as I quoted earlier, the advancements of technology have the ability to either work positively or negatively with the role of faith in one's life. So here, let me show you why I think this is an issue. Where's my slides on this? Sorry. Okay. Let me quickly, should I jump to this? All right, allow me to do a detour until I answer your question. Tell me if I answered it or not. So I do believe, as those who heard me last year, and I've been continuing to study over the last year, that something to do with the way the modern world understands uncertainty is very central to all the problems we're having today, including faith problems and the existence of scientism and the belief in technology as the savior. I'll show you this chart real fast. This shows over the last about 30 years, since the 90s until now, this is the chart of global uncertainty. This is using political and economic metrics. There's actually an entire algorithm behind this has been charted over the last a few decades, and you see blips there. But you can see that from the 90s to today, how much higher global uncertainty is. And here I zoom in a bit, and I'll show you a bit as to where they see those peaks. So they saw it at 9/11. There's a big peak right here, if you can see on my screen. Right, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but right here where it says Iraq war and U.S. recession and 9/11 here in 2000, whatever that is, 2003, it's popping up. Yeah, you see the Iraq war, right? You see the Great Recession here in 2000, whatever this is, 9, 10, where it's popping up. So you see points where, and you see it, COVID, it's sky high right now. That was the highest point since they've ever measured this of uncertainty in the world. Now, why am I talking about uncertainty when we're supposed to talk about technology, right? There is something that I believe that a lot of philosophers are finding as well, that the modern world has created a desire for certainty. And technology has created an illusion of certainty in our lives. And so we have culturally come to crave certainty and to despise uncertainty. And again, this is culturally because we're so accustomed to certainty in our lives. So let's walk through how that works. We can predict our life with increasing certainty every single day. When you are all here today, Think about all the things that helped you be here today. You have an alarm clock that was built using technology with our knowledge of time and the alternation of night and day and everything else with accurate atomic clocks allow you to wake up at an exact time. You got up for your suhoor, perhaps 5 minutes before, you were able to drink your water and have your date and go back to sleep. Whereas before, that was not the case with people. You set your alarm, you get up, you go do this, you do that. Your thermostat allows you to live with an exact temperature within any building throughout the day. GPS allowed you to go anywhere you want, you know exactly the route to take, you know the exact time it's going to get you there. Of course, almost exact, right? But I mean, for most of us, the minute that we arrive somewhere, we can pull out our GPS and say, I need to leave by 3:30 to get there by 4:15. Paychecks arriving exactly on time to the exact penny for most of us. I know my paycheck comes on a Friday, it comes at 5 p.m. and it's going to be X amount of dollars with X amount of cents, right? Transportation gives us the precise food we want year round. You know that you go to the grocery store, you're going to get apples with these varieties. That's all because of modern technology in terms of the way farming works, in the way that that genetically modified foods work, in the way that that vehicles work, in the way everything. So modern medicine, it regulates your body, your blood sugar, all these things in such precise ways. So all I'm going to say and show is that currently, there's never been a time more than today that there is the ability to live a life where you feel a sense of certainty in the way that you operate every single day. But the confusing part is that simultaneously, we're living in a time of global political and economic uncertainty. So there's something strange happening where the mind is like craving and being in this illusion of certainty every single day, but at the same time recognizing, my God, the world is very uncertain at the same time. Like all of us who are young, like I'm the old millennial, right? I'm kind of at the very end of the millennial category. They're going through a lot of uncertainty in terms of housing uncertainty, job uncertainty. The next generation is as well. And so I want to show you this graph that shows us something. To me, it's fascinating. I just collected this data. So a year ago when I showed you stuff, I collected some data. This is data I just collected in January. This is a worldwide population of Muslims, religious Muslims. This is about 4,000 Muslims worldwide. And I measured their uncertainty discomfort, how much they hate uncertainty. Look at these age groups. The bar graphs would have been better, but I didn't have time to convert this. This is just a line graph. Under 18 to 35, 34, pretty much millennials and Gen Zers. Their percentage of, this is a scale of how much you hate uncertainty from not at all to a whole lot. Look at how much higher they are than people who are older. And how as they get older, it goes down as the eldest are the most comfortable with uncertainty. Which means that young people are really, really, really just, they don't like uncertainty in their life. And I would posit it's because they're so used to certainty in their life in one way, as well. And what do I mean? Uncertainty and tolerance means how much you're uncomfortable with not knowing what's going to happen. So we ask questions like, how much does it bother you when you don't know what's going to happen to you tomorrow? Or how much does uncertainty make you feel uneasy and uncomfortable? How paralyzed do you feel when you don't have all the information to make a decision? Those type of questions we ask that tells us how much they don't like being in a state of uncertainty. And so what we find is that young Muslims, as well as non-Muslims in other data, are far more uncomfortable with uncertainty than old people. And we're also finding that young people are also less religious than older people across the world, and in the same data set that I have of 4,000 religious Muslims across 6 continents. And so we find that religious doubts in this slide, you'll see the blue, go very fast with this. The red burgundy one is their uncertainty belief, just like I showed you here. And then this purplish one is the level of religious doubt they have. So the religious doubt is much higher for the younger Muslims than the older Muslims. And a third slide I'll show, I know this is going fast, is that those who are, I classify people by how religious they were, depending on their self-described. People who are more intolerant of uncertainty, those who hate uncertainty, have lower levels of religiosity. So why am I saying all that to set up your question? There is something we have to grapple with as Muslims in the modern world, that how do we position and argue to our young people about how does technology, how should it make us be in awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How do we need to think about comparing the natural world to the technological world? And then there's a verse in the Quran that I find beautiful about this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking in Surah Luqman, and he talks about how he has created, what is the verse? I'll come in a second, the Arabic. right before it, he talks about how he has created the rain coming down from the sky, and he spread forth the animals throughout the world. Anyway, Allah is giving us a lot into the natural world. And then he says, هَذَا خَلْقُ اللَّهِ فَأَرُونِي مَاذَا خَلَقَ الَّذِينَ مِن دُونِهِ وَلِلظَّالِمِينَ فِي ضَلَالٍ مُبِينٍ. Allah is saying, look, this is the creation of Allah. And the human being of the modern world has been detached from the natural world. We're city slickers. We don't live in villages with rivers and with trees and with mountains and with lakes and all the natural beauty and the topography that makes one in awe of the khalq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when you don't see that, you're less likely to invoke that in your life in terms of just being in awe of the creation. And you're going to be in awe of the created. And the created is the technology you see before you. And when you're in awe of the created, you're in awe of the creator of the created, which is the most proximal creator are the human beings that have done it. So you look at the scientists and you look at these corporations and you're just enamored by them. So what does that mean for the Muslim in the modern world? I really don't know. It's painful for me to think about. I think some of the solutions are for Muslims to be in far more touch with the natural world. The Quran is replete with hundreds of ayat, if not thousands, if you add the hadith, that really ask us to ponder and reflect and to immerse ourselves in the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And by stripping ourselves of that experience, I think we're unknowingly shifting our weight into trusting these people and having more the glitter in our eyes that they're somehow at this peak of progress. And then we just kind of don't even realize, because it's in the back of our mind, about what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has done. So that's my answer to that. I didn't answer your question. I'm just setting up why I think it is the way it is. If someone has some insights, I'd love to hear them, because this, I really think, is a crisis that we need to be able to solve with our young generation.
There is a comment, or I guess a question with respect to what you had sort of touched on. You know, the data does show it, but the question is this trend amongst young people having low uncertainty tolerance, do you think that's indicative of our times in particular, or do you think that's a general rule as one becomes more comfortable with uncertainty after having lived with it for so long as they get older?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've grappled with that myself. I think it's both, personally. The reason why I think it's both is that there is something to say for just maturity of life. More life experiences do make people higher in wisdom and just kind of acknowledging that they're not in control. But again, like I said, I think that's because young people are in far much more control of their life than older people were. So those who are here, you know, on this call, who think about their own age groups, right? If you go to these age buckets, if you're over 55, you've lived at a time where you had very little control of these things, right? Actually, if you're under, probably, I mean, even myself growing up, like most of my life, I had no idea when I'd show up somewhere, because I did not have the technology that would show me what time I would arrive somewhere. I didn't have, you know, all the gadgets that really make me control every single thing that I need. But as that has become exacerbated with technology, the young person has so much more control and a desire and a discomfort. So to give an example, most of us have lived with internet most of our life. Not all of us, but most of us, right? I remember when I was a teenager, I had dial-up. And that, if anyone here remembers dial-up, right? Your phone, it rings and it connects to the internet, and it's super slow and it takes minutes to download something. We were comfortable with that. We were very comfortable with the speed of technology at that time, because that was the fastest thing out there. Ask, look what happens to any of your teenagers or young people if the internet goes out for an hour, right? I mean, people literally lose it. I don't know what to do with my life, right? And you're angry and you're frustrated and you feel like yelling and screaming, which goes back to the expectation of certainty in life is so high right now that not having that is a very, very uncomfortable phenomenon. And so you can replace uncertainty with anything else in terms of whatever is known and comfortable. So if certainty is comfortable, well, uncertainty is uncomfortable, right? And I think that is something that we have no way out of, because it's just the nature of the world. So how can you help people? I think you can help by placing people in situations where they actually have to be uncomfortable. And again, for me, a lot of it goes back to my own bias. I deeply believe in spending tremendous amounts of time in nature and going out in the forest and out in the woods and spending time there. Because guess what? You're not very comfortable. You're not in a temperature you can control. It's cold at night, right? You don't have your phone. You don't have time. You don't have a clock, right? Your clock doesn't work out there, right? And you're just literally, you feel this heightened sense of connection to the divine That you're literally in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. At any moment, like you have no idea. A bear could come and attack you, right? Anything could happen and no one would even know that you're gone. You know, a tree could fall, the rain could come pouring down. Like you literally feel nothing but putting up your hands to Allah and thanking Him for everything in life and that He's in control. And so more experiences like that, I think, can help people gain a little bit of flexibility with their lives. So.
Barakallahu feek. That was certainly fascinating. There's a question: how do you balance the shift of one's religious convictions at the university with an obsession with unhealthy ideological purity, as seen with many Muslims who, instead of trying to understand the different ideologies around them, choose to be, and in the brother's word, brain dead? I would opt for a different word. I'd say dismissive, but I hope the question's clear.
Yeah, it is clear. Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's an evolution to how the human being goes through a process of accepting different forms of knowledge. It's natural when one gains affinity towards the deen to quickly discard everything else around them, because you felt that you've been polluted by all this filth around you, right? You have secular, liberal, feminist, all kinds of junk beliefs, you know, in your mind that you've been programmed with from birth to the age of whatever it is. And then all of a sudden you feel enlightened and you want to read scripture, you want to read, you know, all the classical texts, you want to be surrounded by deen 24/7. And only what dini folks have said to you is some form of truth, right? And then you get a little bit older and actually you start to realize that that actual presupposition is false. So I'll give you my own example. Like when I was reading usul in my years, even in Egypt, and I was just fascinated by the scholars of usul. And I'm like, these are just brilliant minds and everything they say is the haqq and it's the truth and these premises, this and that. And I think that's somehow this pristine, unadulterated Islam. And then you realize that even those usuli scholars, especially from the mutakallimin, were heavily influenced by non-Muslim thought in ways that actually were problematic and we should actually discard today, right? But what I'm arguing is that with maturity comes the ability to see that all knowledge we have today is actually it's mixed of a whole bunch of things, right? Yes, exactly. So people are saying Aristotelian logic and usul, right? Which is why I'm very I'm as I go older every year, I become more and more obsessed with Ibn Taymiyyah's thought, because this is the guy who's been able to dismantle the role of logic and Greek philosophy and all the baggage that the Muslim theologians that came up with, especially the Mutakallimun. But I mean, my point is not to get off track, is that we will all arrive at that point at some point in time and saying, you know what, everything we have in our own deen, other than Quran and Sunnah, like it's heavily going to be influenced by other cultures that we live in. So even the foremost scholars of today in deen, right, are going to be influenced by where they live. Right? And they're going to be absorbing some of that air in how they speak. And because they're speaking to a certain audience that has a certain view of the world, and they have to operate under that view of the world. And they'll get to there. So I would advocate patience with the brothers, as well as perhaps showing them some of that in every single field of inquiry. Look at tafsir. Look at how the Mufassirin wrote in each generation and see what type of arguments they brought. Why did Razi write the way Razi wrote? And Razi is writing like a philosopher. He's not writing like a traditional theologian, right, or a traditional mufassir, right? And why did Ghazali write the way he wrote? Why did Ibn Taymiyyah come slamming those ideas? Because they're all responding to the issues of their day. And Muslim scholars of today need to be doing the exact same thing, rather than just saying we're going to only argue from a pristine perspective of absolute Quran and Sunnah. That's impossible. That's living outside of culture, and no one lives outside of culture. Wallahu a'lam.
Okay, our next question. You talked about scientism's impact on culture. What's the relationship between scientism and secularism? Which I think will also be slightly addressed next week as well, but if you want to give your take.
Yeah, I think they're all in bed together. So the same way that it's very hard to say there's some pristine Islam that is nothing but unadulterated Quran and Sunnah, none of these ideologies that we're speaking about today are pristine and pure. They're all been mishmashed because of modernity and postmodernity, and they all rely on one another for legitimacy. So liberalism needs scientism in order to do certain things. And it also is not loyal. So all of these philosophies will discard one another when it's not advantageous. So feminism also will will rely upon scientism at times when it supports its interest. And when it doesn't support its interest, it dumps it. I'll give you some examples of that just to show, and I didn't get into this, I had some slides, but within science, people have to stop assuming that this is independent inquiry. As myself, who's in the space, who publishes in journals, the types of things that journal reviewers, who are the gatekeepers to knowledge, what they impose on authors at times. I'll give you a few examples. One, and I might have mentioned this in the past, I wrote a paper explaining why women choose certain college majors and why men choose different majors. And this is a psychological study about the psychological determinants of career choices. And I was simply explaining, like a scientist would, I'm explaining to you why they do this. So women, they prefer certain fields because they have interests and desires. And here comes the reviewer that says, well, you need to tell us how we can get more women to become scientists now. And I said, I'm not trying to intervene and change the situation. I'm simply trying to explain phenomena. And my phenomena is explaining why people do things. This is what a scientist is meant to do. It's a value judgment to say what women should be doing. That's an example. Here's another example. Studies on IQ. They've done these phenomenal studies on IQ that look at how there's gender differences in certain fields at the very top. So you take the top 1% of scientists or of mathematicians, that there's overrepresentation with men. And you take the top 1% of of brilliant people in like the literary sciences, and they're overrepresented by women. So they can publish the paper without a problem that says that women are far more, they have at the elite level, they're better than men at language and these type of things. But they would not publish the paper about the fact that men at the top 1% were more achieving than women. And the reason they gave was not scientific. They said this is possibly going to be bad for the morale of women. So it's a value-laden judgment. So the trust in science here, this is the problem, is that people assume that science is trying to arrive at truth, but it's not. The feminist is going to use science to promote feminism. The liberal is going to use science to promote liberalism. And when it doesn't confirm with their theory or their ideology, they're going to dump it. So secularism and scientism are really, really tightly related, and they're like husband and wife in bed. And I'm sure next week you'll learn more about that. But they'll get divorced when they need to. Yeah.
Okay. On the note of what, normative action, what someone ought to do or should to do, there's really a comment and question, but regarding the definition of classical freedom, I believe many would have issue with the ought. Who defines or decides what you ought to do? Is consent assumed by belonging to the community? I'm thinking about some cultural manifestations of Islam, although they may not necessarily be Islamic, for instance, where a lot of ought to is asserted. Okay. And that, just to clarify, the questioner can clarify if it's in relation to scientism in particular, if the question is how does scientism define ought to?
Okay, yeah, I can get it. So the first is that the classical definition of freedom, of course, has nothing to do with scientism. It's coming from philosophy and religion. So either a philosopher who has his own way of seeing the world argues that there's an ought, and they've put forth their reasons for it, or scripture does. So if you're a Muslim or you're a Christian, that ought is defined by your faith. It's very clear. What scientism is going to argue, and what secularism is going to argue, or liberalism is going to argue, is that there's no such thing as an ought, because that ought itself, science cannot determine ought. So science has no ability to tell you about morality, because morality cannot be determined. It's not a testable assumption to them, other than their criteria of do no harm. So that's why for the person who believes in strong scientism, it's going to be, we're going to replace the classical definition with the autonomy and the freedom to do what you want to do. And this is why I said they're all in bed together, because the person who is believing in strong scientism is probably relying on liberalism for his definitions. And so liberalism says that the individual's freedom is at the peak. So this is kind of where you're going to find that bifurcation. There will never be an ought given by someone in scientism.
Another relationship question, can naturalism and science be compatible?
Can naturalism and scientism?
Naturalism and science.
Oh, and science. Yes, absolutely. That's why so this is what I was trying to argue for the first 30 minutes. And I know it's a lot of stuff, but like the history of monotheism in religion from the beginning of time all the way until pretty much the 19th century. I skipped over the Darwinian issues that popped up, but even with the Inquisition and Galileo, there still was no serious conflict between the two of these. And science and religion had continuously worked in tandem. And it's literally when evolutionary biology began to assert philosophically that this explains life, that we really had this problem. And I have some quotes that I can show you that are just absolutely absurd, that just kind of show you that these folks are not operating within the field of science. They have mixed, because they know scientism has authority, they can make any statements they want. It would be like, and this is something which I know Al-Arqam is very good about, the truth is not known by the person speaking it, right? I don't care if you're Ibn Taymiyyah, or if you're Ghazali, or if you're anybody other than a prophet. The prophet's words are automatically truth because he's a prophet, right? And any messenger, or the words of Allah. Beyond that, we can scrutinize any human being's statement. But what we often do is, because we trust somebody, we take anything they say as truth, even if it's far outside of the domain that they're supposed to be speaking about. So here's some statements I think show this. Give me a second. Okay, here we go. So they asked this professor at Cornell, what does modern evolutionary biology tell us loud and clear? And look at his statement. Evolutionary biology, his answer is, there are no gods, no purposes, no goal-directed forces of any kind. There is no life after death. When I die, I'm absolutely certain that I'm going to be dead. That's the end for me. There is no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning to life, and no free will for humans either. What in the world does this have to do with evolutionary biology? I mean, literally, evolutionary biology has nothing to do with existence of God, purpose in life, and life after death. In fact, even if it could tell you that we came from monkeys and apes, it still has nothing to do with life after death. So the problem here is that people who are championing the cause of science today, who are in that camp of extreme, strong scientism adherence, they are the ones who are co-opting the entire conversation around religion and throwing out these statements. All right, here's another one, again by the idiot large Steven Pinker, who says the findings of science entail that the belief systems of all the world's religions are factually mistaken. We know the laws governing the physical world, including accidents, disease, misfortunes, have no goal that pertain to human well-being. There's no such thing as fate, karma, spells, or answered prayers. How could he possibly test that assertion if he's a scientist, right? So it's the overstepping of the bounds of the scientific community today that is really the problem. It's not science as an endeavor that is problematic. So I think that the Muslim world, I think that the religious religious scientists need to really reclaim science and need to really dump, how it's been hijacked, by these folks who are ascribing to scientism.
That's a perfect segue into this question, which is, do you think ignorant statements by ulama about science strengthen the appeal of scientism? For example, in the past year, it seemed many ulama were opposed to public health measures related to COVID. For example, in Pakistan, all sects opposed limits on religious gatherings.
Okay. Yes, so a couple things. So there's two ways to think about this. It goes back to the same premise I made, that the very first slide I showed you, the religious scholar and the scientist. We in society trust the scientist more. That's just the default. That's just, Muslim, non-Muslim, religious, not religious, that's become almost the default of people. So now what does that do? And there's a sociological phenomena to this we cannot ignore, which is in the Muslim world in particular, our ulama are typically not from the elite achievers on average, right? I say this very plainly. Someone who was in al-Azhar, and people in Medina have talked the same thing. To get into Shari'ah is pretty much to be at the bottom of your academic class. I met only a couple people in all of Shari'ah who could have been in medicine or engineering or law, who chose not to be, who chose Shari'ah. Everyone else had no choice, and they could not classify, they could not pass to get into those higher fields. So there is a general just acknowledgement in the Muslim world that the ulama are not from the brightest thinkers, which we need to change. Now, that only makes it more problematic, is that you have somebody who you're already skeptical of their intelligence, making statements about a field that they're not experts in. Whereas, for instance, this evolutionary biologist can talk a bunch of junk about religion and people will believe him because they trust his knowledge and they think he's an intellectual. So they take his bogus without dissecting it. But the scholar in this case, even if he says that which is true scientifically, because we don't trust him to begin with, it's going to be scrutinized. So in this case, of course, there are ulama who made a bunch of bogus statements about COVID, and it's going to undermine their, it's going to cause more doubts in the minds of Muslims who believe deeply in science. I will now interject though and say COVID is a perfect example of how science is such a limiting source of knowledge for anything, because it's only as good as time can tell you as well as the data can tell you. So here's, I have a slide for this I want to get into. I think I had something on COVID. I'll just talk about it if I don't have it. But here we go. So all of science is dhanni. This is important. And dhanni meaning it's probabilistic. Probability is a backbone of all statistical modeling. So even COVID. So let's not fall into the other end of the spectrum where we think that everything scientists have said about COVID is true. Most of it is bogus as well. It relies on having high quality data, which is often not obtainable, right? Observation is limited by the instruments we have. The gold standard in science is 95% confidence intervals. So those who do statistics know that, right? That if I measure something and I want to make a conclusion of whether I'm accurate or not, I have what I call these confidence intervals because I know there's error in this endeavor. It's 90. I think if I did it 100 times, 95% times out of 100, I'd be right, which means you believe there's a 5% chance of error all the time, right? So let's get into human error number one. We as human beings are flawed. So our process of doing science, COVID research, anything else is limited because we are prone to making mistakes. Number two, there is massive human deception in science because it's not about finding the truth. It is about confirming what you believe in half the time. So in any scientific journal, the typical norm is that you put forth a hypothesis and then you have to go around confirming it typically. And if you don't confirm it, you usually don't publish it. That's just the way it works. So I think that X is related to Y. If I do a study and X relates to Y, well, then I go ahead and I publish a study. But what's the point of doing the study if I already knew X was related to Y? And if X wasn't related to Y, I don't publish it. And then we don't know that that's not the case. So COVID is an example. Now, why do the imams or why do religious scholars say some of these things? Because also they find that the scientific community oversteps their bounds. So when COVID first came about a year ago, when we were having these conversations, everyone was worried about surface transmission because the scientific community was saying that these things transmit on surfaces, so on and so forth. Turns out COVID doesn't really transmit on surfaces, so we don't need to be doing all that cleaning. 6 feet was a scientific recommendation. Now that has been called into question. There's a recent MIT study that came out that said it was not about distance, it was about duration indoors that mattered more. The efficacy of masks, right? All that has been debated, of course, by scientists. Of course, the general finding is that they are helpful. Vaccines, yes, they're helpful. But just to give you some insight, there was folks who were critical about the early Johnson & Johnson research that said there's problems with it, and they got banned. And their papers got pulled off of the scientific community, and they were banned from social media. And it turns out later on that Johnson & Johnson's vaccine had some issues. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I have my COVID vaccine. I'm not here to say that. All I'm trying to say is that this is not haqq that is being promoted. It is all probabilistic. And so the same way that we should not throw the imam or the scholar under the bus because he is more skeptical of science than often many of the lay community is. And maybe that's a problem. But at the end of the day, he could be wrong and the scientists could be wrong as well. So imams have to be very careful about knowing the cultural status of science and religion and ensuring they don't put themselves in a position where they could actually jeopardize people's confidence and faith because that's just where they're coming from as a place of inferiority. So.
Okay, I know we're nearing time, so I think there's a good question by a sister that might be a good way to end, inshallah, which is just if you have any book recommendations in this area regarding philosophy of science or sort of what you've discussed today.
Oh man, a particular book. So the best thing I've read on the subject, it comes from Christians, and it's because they have been dealing with this issue for longer than we have in the West. There's a good book. It's called, do I have it somewhere here? It's not perfect, but it's called Scientism and Secularism by J.P. Moreland. I can type it in the chat if you want to. I think he did a really good job as a Christian scholar who's also happens to be, a scientist, of highlighting, and I took a lot of the things from my presentation, some of it came from his book, that were very helpful in laying out what is scientism, what's problematic about it. Again, there's a lot of limitations in it. So again, we can't take anything as is. I think reading good science is actually one of the best ways I've found. So I read this book a few months ago. It's called Our Universe. I'm not recommending this as a scientism book, but it's called Our Universe, An Astronomer's Guide. And it's a Princeton astrophysicist. She writes about how pretty much we've come to learn about the entire universe from the beginning of time to now. And what she keeps coming back to is the error in this process about how we're so limited as human beings in discovering the natural world and how mistakes are made. Even Einstein, she talks about how the equations that we set up to explain the natural world, if anyone here is in math or modeling, they know that any set of observable characteristics, you can rearrange correlations to be the same. So if I said X is correlated with Y, I can also say Y is correlated with X, and it's the exact same numbers will hold. So her point in this book is that it's very humbling for her as an astrophysicist to write this, but I took from this book how limited scientists are in arriving at the truth, yet how much they have learned. And so I think reading good science by people who are not hard believers in scientism is the best way to really understand the balance between using our faith and using other sources of information along with science to understand the world. There's another good book if you're really curious. I have some, maybe I'll stick in the chat. There's some other good books out there on the limits of science in reasoning. So,
and this is just a factual question you may know off the top of your head. Is it true that Darwin did believe in the existence of God?
So I am not an expert in evolutionary biology and Darwin's life. I did read in my research that Darwin was heavily influenced by one of his teachers, or one of the people who came before him. I think his name was Pasley, if I remember correctly, or Paisley. It'll come to my mind. And those natural philosophers were heavily writing about order in the universe and being kind of influenced by kind of uncovering God's beauty. And early folks in his peers saw Allah's signs in a lot of their own research. He ended up dumping all of that eventually. So I think it's highly likely to say that Darwin was influenced by monotheists who were looking to uncover God's laws in their work, but he turned on them eventually later in life. That's the most accurate I could say.
Okay, inshallah. So it is 3 o'clock here in California. We've extended, or we've used the full 2 hours, inshallah. So we'll go ahead and conclude here. Just a reminder that inshallah next week will be our last and final session on secularism by Sister Dania. So, do feel free to attend that. Inshallah, one of the moderators will put a link just if you wanted to watch the last few lectures as well as the one today. Again, we appreciate everybody showing up and participating, inshallah. Dr. Uthman, do you mind closing us off with Dua Khatm al-Majlis?
Sure, inshallah. So Jazakallah everyone for coming and taking your time during these sacred days. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase us in understanding. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to, through our understanding of our deen, to better understand the world that's around us. اللهم اهدنا فيمن هديت وعافنا فيمن عافيت وتولنا فيمن توليت وبارك لنا فيما أعطيت إنك تقضي بالحق سبحانك ولا يقضى عليك ولك الشكر بما أعطيت نستغفرك اللهم من جميع الذنوب والخطايا ونتوب إليك ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب اللهم ألف بين قلوبنا اللهم وحد صفوفنا اللهم اهدنا واهد بنا واجعلنا سببا لمن اهتدى. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase us in knowledge. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us of all of our shortcomings and our mistakes. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to preserve our iman and the iman of our children and the generation of Muslims to come. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us yaqeen in the sources of our faith as the sources of truth in the Quran and in the words of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I ask Allah the way He's gathered us here today, that He gathers us in the highest gardens of paradise, so we may sit in the company and dwell in the righteous company of the martyrs and of the scholars and of the Sahaba and of the Anbiya. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.